You can feel it right now. This team is sitting in the middle of some really interesting decisions, and honestly, the next few weeks could tell us a lot about where things are heading. There's drama around the quarterback room, trade rumors starting to heat up, and some moves behind the scenes that could end up being way bigger than people think. And the crazy part is, it feels like this is only the beginning. If you're riding with the black and gold this season, smash that like button and drop "Here we go" down in the comments so I know the real Steelers fans are in the building. Brendan Sorsby's situation is suddenly becoming one of the most fascinating stories connected to the Pittsburgh Steelers right now. And the timing of everything could completely reshape how fans look at the team's quarterback future heading into the season. What makes this entire conversation so intense is the fact that Sorsby is no longer just some college quarterback prospect being casually discussed by scouts. According to the report, the NCAA denied his request to regain eligibility after his gambling-related issues, and now there is a growing possibility that he could enter the NFL supplemental draft in the coming weeks. That immediately changes everything for quarterback-needy teams around the league, including Pittsburgh. The report explains that Sorsby recently completed a 35-day gambling rehab program and has been trying to address what was described as a sports gambling disorder. He admitted to betting activities during his time at Indiana and Cincinnati, and now he is attempting to move forward while appealing the NCAA's decision. His court date is reportedly set for June 1st, while the supplemental draft entry deadline is June 22nd. The key part of this story is not just the controversy surrounding him. It is the level of talent attached to his name. According to the information discussed, Sorsby was viewed by many as a quarterback with potential first-round value if he had entered the regular draft process. The comparison made was that he could have landed somewhere in the late first-round or early second-round range, with some believing he would have gone even higher than Drew Aller. That is what makes this situation so difficult for Pittsburgh. The Steelers already invested heavily in the quarterback position by drafting Drew Aller with the 76th overall pick, and there is also growing confidence internally regarding Will Howard's development. But now another physically gifted young quarterback could unexpectedly become available before training camp even begins. And physically, Sorsby appears to check almost every box Pittsburgh has been looking for. The report specifically points to the type of quarterback profile the Steelers have been targeting: size, arm strength, toughness, and the ability to handle AFC North football. Sorsby reportedly stands 6'3", weighs 235 pounds, and combines that frame with mobility and athleticism. That combination is what separates him from a lot of quarterback prospects. The discussion describes him as someone capable of throwing from different arm angles with a strong and elastic arm, while also being able to move outside the pocket and create with his legs. And that is where the comparison to Drew Aller becomes extremely interesting. The report mentions that Aller is viewed as talented, but not nearly as mobile, while Sorsby brings a legitimate rushing threat element to the quarterback position. So now, the Steelers face a difficult question. If Sorsby truly has first-round physical talent, and if he becomes available through the supplemental draft, how aggressive should Pittsburgh actually be? That is where opinions start to split. The report suggests that Pittsburgh should absolutely have interest in Sorsby, but not at the cost of a first, second, or major Day 2 draft pick. Instead, the recommendation presented was a fourth-round pick as the highest reasonable offer. But even that may not be enough. Several quarterback-needy teams were mentioned as potential threats to outbid Pittsburgh, including the Buccaneers, Panthers, Vikings, Cardinals, Jets, and Browns. And honestly, that makes sense considering how rare quarterbacks with high-level physical tools are. The biggest issue for Pittsburgh may not even be the draft pick compensation. The real issue could be what bringing in Sorsby says about the Steelers' current quarterback plan. Because if the Steelers aggressively pursue him, it creates immediate pressure inside an already crowded quarterback room. The report directly states that adding Sorsby could force difficult roster decisions involving Mason Rudolph, Will Howard, and potentially even Drew Aller, depending on how things develop through training camp. That is a massive complication for a team already trying to balance short-term competitiveness with long-term quarterback development. The current plan appears to revolve around developing Aller and Howard behind Aaron Rodgers inside Mike McCarthy's quarterback system, with hopes that one of those younger quarterbacks eventually develops into a legitimate starter by 2027. So if Pittsburgh suddenly pivots toward Sorsby, that could signal uncertainty about the quarterbacks they already invested in. At the same time, the argument for taking a chance on Sorsby is hard to ignore. If teams truly believed he had first-round talent before the gambling controversy, then acquiring him for a second, third, or fourth-round supplemental draft pick could technically become tremendous value. But the off-field concerns remain impossible to separate from the football conversation. The report repeatedly emphasizes that Sorsby comes with major red flags tied to decision-making and gambling behavior, even though he is now reportedly taking steps to address those problems through treatment and rehabilitation. And that is why this entire situation feels so unpredictable right now. One path leads toward Pittsburgh sticking with the developmental plan they already created around Aller and Howard. The other path involves taking a calculated risk on a quarterback prospect with massive upside but equally massive uncertainty attached to his future. At the same time, another Steelers-related rumor is beginning to gain traction involving Caleb Johnson and the Green Bay Packers. That story exploded after Packers running back Josh Jacobs was reportedly arrested on multiple domestic abuse-related charges, including battery, criminal damage to property, strangulation, suffocation, disorderly conduct, and intimidation of a victim. The report stresses that Jacobs is innocent until proven guilty, but also acknowledges how serious the allegations are and how dramatically this could affect Green Bay's running back situation moving forward. Because if the Packers move on from Jacobs, they suddenly become desperate for backfield help. And that is where Caleb Johnson enters the conversation. According to the discussion, Green Bay's current depth behind Jacobs is not viewed as particularly strong, which could force the Packers to explore veteran options or trade possibilities. Johnson was specifically mentioned as a potential fit because of his success in outside zone concepts coming out of Iowa. The report argues that Matt LaFleur's system in Green Bay could fit Johnson extremely well due to the amount of outside zone running concepts involved. But there is another layer to this discussion, because Mike McCarthy also reportedly likes using outside zone principles, meaning Johnson could still eventually carve out a role in Pittsburgh too. That is why the Steelers may not be eager to move him unless the return becomes worthwhile. Even though Johnson currently sits behind Jaylen Warren and Rico Dowdle on the depth chart, the report still describes him as valuable depth and a player the organization reportedly believes in long-term. There is also concern about simply giving away a young running back with upside before fully discovering what he can become. The suggested minimum trade value mentioned was a fifth-round pick, although even that was described as less than ideal, considering Pittsburgh originally spent a third-round pick to bring him in. So now Steelers fans are suddenly watching two completely different storylines unfold at the same time. One involves the possibility of Pittsburgh making a shocking move for a controversial quarterback prospect with elite physical traits. The other involves whether the Steelers should sacrifice young running back depth to capitalize on Green Bay's unexpected situation. And both conversations could directly impact how this roster looks before the season even begins. What do Steelers fans think Pittsburgh should actually do here? Take a chance on Brendan Sorsby if he enters the supplemental draft, or stay fully committed to Drew Aller and Will Howard moving forward? The Steelers also quietly made a couple of moves that could become more important later in the season than people initially realize, especially when you look at the defensive line depth and the salary cap flexibility Pittsburgh is trying to create heading into training camp. One of those moves was the return of Dean Lowry. According to the report, the Steelers officially brought back the veteran defensive tackle after he missed last season because of a torn ACL suffered during training camp. That part matters because Pittsburgh clearly believes he is now healthy enough to contribute again as a depth defensive lineman. And depth across the defensive front becomes critical once the regular season starts wearing players down physically. The interesting thing here is that this was not presented as some massive headline move designed to completely transform the defense. Instead, it feels more like Pittsburgh reinforcing the roster quietly in areas they believe could become vulnerable over the course of a long season. And honestly, that approach lines up with several of the other decisions discussed throughout the report. The Steelers do not appear interested in making reckless moves right now. Whether it is the hesitation to overpay for Brendan Sorsby in the supplemental draft, or the reluctance to move Caleb Johnson unless the return becomes worthwhile, the organization seems focused on preserving flexibility instead of forcing dramatic roster decisions. That same strategy also showed up in the details involving Pat Freiermuth's contract restructure. According to SpotTrack, Pittsburgh converted $385 million of Freiermuth's 2026 salary into a signing bonus, creating roughly $4.25 million in cap space. That move reportedly leaves the Steelers with approximately $7.2 million in projected top 51 cap space. And when you examine the numbers more closely, it becomes clear that Pittsburgh approached this move carefully instead of going all in financially. The updated cap hits discussed in the report show Freiermuth sitting just under $7 million this season, climbing above $14 million next year before dropping again in 2028. What stands out is that the Steelers reportedly could have pushed the restructure even further, but intentionally chose not to maximize every possible dollar immediately. That tells you something about how the organization is trying to manage its roster construction right now. Instead of creating short-term cap relief at any cost, Pittsburgh appears to be balancing present flexibility with future stability. And honestly, when you connect all the stories discussed throughout this report, a bigger picture starts forming around what the Steelers may actually be trying to build. At quarterback, they already have multiple developmental options in Drew Aller and Will Howard, while Aaron Rodgers provides the veteran presence for now. At running back, they are protecting depth instead of rushing into a trade involving Caleb Johnson. Along the defensive line, they are bringing back experienced depth pieces like Dean Lowry. Financially, they are restructuring contracts carefully without completely mortgaging future flexibility through aggressive cap manipulation. And that is why the Brendan Sorsby discussion feels so important right now. Because if Pittsburgh suddenly decides to aggressively pursue him in the supplemental draft, it would represent one of the first truly aggressive pivots away from the developmental structure they already seem committed to building. That does not mean they will completely ignore the opportunity. The report clearly states that Pittsburgh should have interest in Sorsby because the physical tools are absolutely there. But there is a major difference between monitoring a player and restructuring your entire quarterback room around him, especially when the Steelers already appear invested in developing younger quarterbacks internally over the next couple of years. And that is why this situation remains so fascinating for Steelers fans. On pure talent alone, Sorsby may absolutely be worth taking a chance on. But once you factor in the gambling controversy, the crowded quarterback room, the developmental timeline already in place, and the draft compensation required to land him, the decision becomes far more complicated than simply asking whether he can throw the football. At the same time, the Caleb Johnson rumors also reveal something important about how other teams may still view Pittsburgh's young talent. Even though Johnson currently projects as the third running back, The fact that his name is already being connected to another organization shows there is still belief in his upside around the league. And that creates another challenge for Pittsburgh moving forward. Do you cash in on potential value now before a player's role shrinks even further? Or do you trust your depth and continue developing younger talent internally? Those are the kinds of decisions that quietly shape rosters long before the regular season starts. And over the next several weeks, the Steelers could be forced to make multiple difficult choices depending on how these situations evolve. If Sorsby officially enters the supplemental draft, the pressure around Pittsburgh's quarterback strategy will immediately intensify. If Green Bay becomes desperate for running back help, the Caleb Johnson conversations could suddenly become very real. And if injuries begin piling up during camp, moves like re-signing Dean Lowry may end up looking much smarter than they do right now. There is a lot happening around this team at the moment, and the most interesting part is that many of these stories are still just beginning to unfold. So now the question shifts directly to Steelers Nation. Would you take the gamble on Brendan Sorsby's talent despite all the risks surrounding him? Or would you stay committed to the quarterbacks already inside the building? And if Green Bay really called about Caleb Johnson, what would it take for you to approve that trade? Drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel for all the latest Steelers news and rumors, leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and make sure you click the video that's now appearing on your screen, because the fastest Steelers updates and exclusive coverage are always right here.